All right, good morning, everybody. This video will be about it'll be a lab walkthrough for the not what causes sorry, it's early morning. It'll be a lab walkthrough for biology of skin color. Super important lab, especially after studying Mendelian genetics and a little bit of Mendelian genetics and how traits are inherited and stuff. I think this is a great one. It speaks volumes to some of the social issues that we're having right now, and helping people that maybe aren't aware of where like different skin colors come from. And it's a great way to think about how natural selection and evolution have shaped the pigmentation of human skin over the last couple of millennia. And so this is I love this lab. So, anyways, let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen. If I'm not already, let's do it. And what I've done is I have taken the lab. I've downloaded it as a PDF. Now, if you're watching this video, make sure that you're editing this lab as a PDF. Do not open this in Google Drive or in Google Docs, or some of the material is actually going to be missing. So, yeah, please edit that in Google Doc, or don't edit it in Google Docs. Just either print it off as a PDF, or you can do it as edit PDF on small PDF. And then some of you guys have PDF editors, so that works too. All right. And so the objectives of this lab is just to understand how skin pigmentation for humans is an evolutionary adaptation that has a trade-off between protection against UV radiation, meaning like there's something called folate that circulates in our bloodstream, and UV light breaks it down. And then there's a trade-off of that sort of protection because, darker skin, you won't have as much UV light breaking down your folate. Also with darker skin, there's less stimulation for vitamin D production, and so you don't get as much vitamin D, which acts as a hormone in the body. Um, we want to explain how these adaptations are heritable traits that provide both survival and reproductive advantage. And so we'll talk about some of the hypotheses that surround why certain skin colors evolved, and we will kind of arrive at a conclusion. And then we'll also create our own scientific diagram. It's pretty simple. All right, so our closest relative primates, like in our little primate tree, have pale skin underneath dark fur, but human skin comes in a variety of colors, pinkish white all the way to dark brown. And so we ask, how did these variations arise? We know most biological traits have been shaped by natural selection, a few by genetic drift. To determine whether the variation in human skin color is a result of evolution or natural selection, we look for patterns that reveal an association between the trait, the skin color, and the environment. And then we look for selective pressures, like what sort of environmental pressures would explain that association. And so we're gonna watch this video called "The Biology of Skin Color." In it, Dr. Nina Jablonski will go through a couple of the biological molecular things that have to do with skin color. It's actually a really well done feature on YouTube. And then we'll talk about the selective pressures and migration and how that all affects who's at risk for, lack of vitamin D, or who's at risk for getting their folate destroyed. All right, so is there a connection between UV radiation and skin color? So in the video, oh, sorry, pause. Watch a video. It's 20 minutes long. It's definitely worth watching. And I'm not going to tell you all the answers in this lab, but I'm going to help you understand what it is that I expect you to write for each blank in this lab. So pause the video, watch the video, pause this video, watch that video, and then come back. Okay, so if you watch that video, it's pretty fascinating, right? She explains that the sun emits energy over a wide spectrum, UV light being one of those spectrums. You can't see UV light. It's a little bit more intense than regular light. And we learned this in our photosynthesis lab, our photosynthesis lecture too. And then if you feel warmth, warmth is a longer wave radiation that can't be seen. It's not as much energy, but it feels warm. And we know that UV light has both positive and negative effects on human health, as you learned. And then the amount of UV radiation that actually hits the surface of the earth is going to vary depending on where you're at in the earth, what time of day it is, how high you are, whether there's clouds in the sky. And so the UV index, which we're going to see on the next page, is a way that sort of says, okay, how much UV light is actually going to make it to the surface of the Earth at any given location on this day. And so that's what we're looking at here is it's a heat map, and the warmer you are on the heat map, the higher the UV exposure is, or the UV index in that area. And so this particular heat map was created on September 24th in 2015. You can see that the scale goes from 0 to 18, 18 being white hot, 0 being black, and then in the middle, the warmer you are to when you're getting into reds and yellows and stuff and pinks and whites, that's where you're getting the most UV exposure. Most of you guys will have a color printout of this, but if you have a black one, black and white one, you're going to need to pull this up on the computer in order to see the difference. All right, so the first thing that we see, well, let's also describe the y-axis here. So if you can't tell, the 0 here is the equator, and then as you head up to 90 degrees north and 90 degrees south, 90 degrees north being plus 90, 90 degrees south being minus 90, that's the two poles. Okay. Describe the pattern of the UV index. And so you could say, well, it appears like the UV index looks higher towards the equator. And then as you move away from the equator towards the poles, the UV index decreases. So we're going to find our approximate location on the map. So we know we're in Arizona. It looks like we're in the green on this day. Definitely not this year. September was like insanely hot. Lots of UV light hitting us. But it said, what's the UV index value of your state on this particular day? Well, if we look, it's in the green. I mean, Arizona's right around here. And so we'd say an 8, 8.5. And then number 3, look at the regions that receive the most intense UV light. So that's light pink. Why do these areas have high UV intensity? Well, I can see the UV light here. This is the Andes Mountains, and so that's high elevation. I believe there's some mountains out here off the coast of Australia and the Polynesian Islands. I believe there's some high elevation there. And so it's close. So there's 2 reasons, right? So why is it the most intense? Well, one is that it's right along the equator. And then the second is that it's high elevation. Yeah, the Andes Mountains are some of the highest mountains because you have the collision of the continental plates of South America and then the oceanic plate of the Pacific Ocean. They're colliding into each other. And instead of subverting or one going underneath the other, they're actually pushing into each other. And they're both, if you're looking at me, they're pushing into each other and then going up. And so the Andes Mountains are growing, sort of like the Himalayas are where India, the continent of India is, well, it's not a continent, but it's on its own tectonic plate. The India has crashed into Asia, and then they are doing the same thing. They're pushing, and that's where you get like in places like Nepal, you have like Mount Everest is like, of course, the tallest mountain in the world. So, okay, in the film, so Dr. Jablonski talks about melanin, and so melanin is that dark pigment that is produced in the skin, and that melanin absorbs UV light and protects us from UV light. We learned that the genetics of melanin are basically like this, is that you produce pheomelanin, and then pheomelanin is converted into eumelanin, which is dark brown and black. And so that conversion of pheomelanin to eumelanin is facilitated by an enzyme. And if that enzyme is downregulated because of transcription factors, if it's downregulated, then you're going to end up with more of a lightish, reddish, pinkish skin color. And so we could write a hypothesis for where in the world we would expect to find human populations with darker or lighter skin pigmentation. Well, let's see that real quick. So if UV light protects us from skin damage if I am sleepy still, if melanin protects us, and we're talking about eumelanin, protects us from UV radiation, and UV radiation is highest near the equator, I would hypothesize that you would find more concentrations of populations with people that have eumelanin near the equator than and people with pheomelanin the closer you get to the poles, or the further you go out in latitude. So you can write that hypothesis in right here. Or you can rephrase it and say it how you want to. And then now here we kind of test that hypothesis. So now we look at another figure. And so this figure here has to do with skin reflection. So it's skin color related. So it's how much light is reflected off your skin. And so one way that we can do that is they shine a light onto a part of the skin. And typically it's the upper inside of your arm, so underneath your sleeve near your armpit. Not your armpit because that's covered in hair for some people. But yeah, so just right outside the armpit on the underside of the arm. And then they measure how much of that light is reflected back. And so we know that white colors are, well, white's not a color, really. White reflects all frequencies of light. And so the lighter, closer to whiter your skin color is, the more reflective it is. And dark skin is going to absorb more of the visible light spectrum than the light skin. And so what this table or this graph is showing us is that the lower the reflectance value, so that's the y-axis, is how much light is reflecting back. The lower the reflectance value, the darker the skin. And then they've associated. So what they did was they took a bunch of people. Let's see, it doesn't really say how they did it. It said available reflectance data from multiple sources were combined to form the graph. All combined data were used the reflectometer with an output of 680 nanometers. So that's a visible light spectrum. Okay. So anyways, what we can see here is that they took these samples of people, populations from all different latitudes on the Earth, and then measured their inner arm reflectancy. And what they found is they were testing this hypothesis that I just gave you guys here, is that the closer to the equator you are, the darker your skin is. And that the further away from the equator you go, the lighter your skin is. And so one of the first questions is like, okay, let's think about where they're sampling. Why are they sampling from the subject's upper inner arm? Why not like their forearm or their face or the back of their neck? So consider that some people are, like not everybody works indoors. Some people work outdoors. Some people work in the sun all day. And so even though skin color is a genetically predetermined trait, there's also environmental factors that affect skin reflectance as well, such as how much time you're actually spending in the sun. So UV light actually boosts the production of the enzyme that converts pheomelanin into eumelanin. And so that makes your skin darker or tanner if you are a lighter colored person. All right. And so why is it from the subject's inner arm? Well, it's the one place it's the one proper place that you don't where the sun doesn't shine. That's not awkward. so so they take it from there, and so that way they're getting just sort of like the genetic expression of melanin on that particular part of the body. All right, so the relationship between skin reflectance, that's the y-axis, and latitude. So consider the direction and steepness of the line slope. So what does that mean? Well, the first part's pretty simple, right? It's basically skin reflectance increases as you go up in latitude. But then the second part, you kind of have to address both the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. And so what it appears like is the southern hemisphere actually gets quite a bit more sun than the northern hemisphere. That's what I would say. If you kind of catch my drift there, because it's steeper in the northern hemisphere. So that means you get much lighter as you go north than when you go south from the equator. And so that probably has a lot to do with the tilt of the Earth itself. Something interesting there you can throw in. And then do these data support your hypothesis from 4? And it did support mine, but maybe your hypothesis wasn't supported, and you can explain why it wasn't. But yeah, it seems like that the further away from the equator you go, the lighter the skin color genetically. All right, so what selective pressure resulted in these different skin colors? So what does it mean, like a trait like light skin coloration, to be under negative selection in equatorial Africa? Relate negative selective pressure to what we know about the MC1R allele diversity among African populations. All right, so this question is actually deserves quite a bit of writing, if you will. So negative selection is this idea that it's selected against. So that means like if it shows up, it usually is removed from the population by either a survival thing or nobody wants to reproduce with that person. And so negative selection would keep people from breeding or staying alive and reproducing. And so light skin coloration, why would that be under negative selection near equatorial Africa? Well, light skin coloration is going to have much more damage done to the cells and the DNA in the cells due to the high exposure to UV light. There's little protection for it. And so, because of that, because it's under negative selective pressure, the MC1R allele, which is the one that converts pheomelanin into eumelanin, it's not going to be very diverse, meaning it's going to be fixed to be very dark under African populations. And so, what we do see is we see a lack of variation in that particular allele or in that particular gene in the African populations because any other variation is going to create lighter skin color and be negatively selected against. So, why does Dr. Jablonski dismiss the hypothesis that protection from skin cancer provided selection for the evolution of darker skin? Well, let's think about that. So, skin cancer is a disease that comes usually after an individual reproduces. And so, skin cancer will kill you, of course, but it won't kill you before you have kids. And then you're passing on your genetic predisposition for skin cancer over and over and over again. And so, skin cancer can't really be the selective pressure that removes it. Um, that's why it's because the skin cancer is usually a later trait that shows up in life. And so it won't keep somebody from reproducing. That's basically her idea. All right, so we can use the data below. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so I can do this. So we're going to make a chart. So what these guys did, and this has to do with folate, right? So this Dr. Jablonski dismisses the hypothesis that skin cancer is the reason for the evolution of darker skin. And she supports it with this data that folate, and folate, I don't know if you picked it up in the video, but folate is one of those vitamins that if you're pregnant and you have low folate levels, then during critical periods of development for your fetus, the spine is going to malform. And anytime a spine is malformed, I mean, that's your axis of communication within your body. And so you're going to get an individual that is less likely to survive and less likely to reproduce if they have a malformed spine. And so that would provide a sufficient explanation for why we see negative selection against lighter skin colors towards the equator. Is that if you have lighter skin color, it doesn't protect your folate from UV light. And if you're pregnant, that's bad news for your offspring. Okay, and so to test this, so what they did was they took 10 people and they exposed them to intense UV light for at least 30 to 60 minutes, once or twice a week for 3 months. So basically, they got free tanning sessions. 64 individuals not receiving this treatment, that would be a control, served as a control. So the difference between the two groups was statistically significant. So that means that the differences between the two groups, the probability that it was due to chance, the two differences, like these two in the y in the dependent variable, how much how much folate was circulating in their bloodstream after these 3 months. That means the difference between 7.3 and 4, so the difference between the two groups' averages was like 5 out of 1,000 chance that difference is just due to chance. And so that means the difference was probably not due to chance, and it was probably because the UV light was lowering the folate levels. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to actually graph this. And so construct a bar chart, and this will take just a minute, and maybe you guys can bear with me here. So on the y-axis, we need to put this would be our folate levels. And so let's type that in. This would be folate levels. Folate levels in the units are nanogram per milliliter. Yeah. And then on the x-axis, this will be our treatment groups. So one is the control, and so we'll make sure we label that as well. So we'll do a control group, and we'll put the control group right here, make a bar chart out of that, and then we'll put this is the UV treatment group. I'll put that right there. And then we just need to put some values here. And so what we can do is we'll say, okay, how about like 1, 2, that'll be 1. And then we'll copy and paste that. And then we'll put that here. Sorry, bear with me here. So we'll put 1 there. We'll put 2 here. Let's see, skip 1, put 3 there. Skip 1, put 4 there. Put 5 there. I have to kind of shift some things around so that's not in the way. There we go. Put 5. This is hard because the little move it icon. Uh, 4. Just making this look pretty. And 3. It doesn't have to be perfect, you guys, but at least, make it presentable. I'm gonna move that there. And then do 7 here. Oh, not 8, but 7. And 7's gonna go there. Okay. And so now all I gotta do is graph my data. And so I'm gonna take this, let's go ahead and just draw, get a nice big fat line. And then let's do 2 different colors. So we'll do the control was 7.3. So we'll go 7.3. So that's about where the control is. Just kind of shade all that in. Make it as neat as you can. I understand that there are some limitations to doing this stuff with a mouse on the computer. But try to make it look nice. And then we'll do green for the UV treatment. And they had 4 nanograms. And there's our scientific data for that. And so what that tells you is it says, okay, they've tested this. And it sure as hell appears like UV light will reduce your folate levels. And that's a problem if you're pregnant. And so you can talk about that here. So describe the relationship between folate levels and UV exposure. The higher the UV exposure, the lower the folate levels. And so the question is, okay, well, why? I mean, if folate gets destroyed with UV light, why don't we just all have dark skin and we'll all be protected from that? Well, one of the reasons is that UV light also stimulates vitamin D production. So that's our trade-off. So unlike many essential nutrients, vitamin D is produced by the body. Stand by. Okay, so one of the reasons that vitamin D is essential to the human body. So there's a lot of reactions that happen that, UV light is going to strike this like 7-dehydrocholesterol molecule, which turns into vitamin D3. The liver processes it, turns it into 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. And then in the kidneys, it gets converted again by another series of enzymatic reactions to become 1,2,5-dihydroxy vitamin D, which is the actual thing that maintains calcium balance and all the other good stuff that vitamin D does. Pardon moi. So it helps absorption of certain minerals, which is great. It helps with strong bones. It also helps with the reproductive health, strong immune system. So vitamin D has many, many functions in the human body. It's not just calcium and bones. It's like immune system, reproductive health. And so that's because vitamin D is a lipid-based vitamin. So it actually goes through your cell membrane straight to your DNA and targets genes in the DNA and turns them on and off. And so it functions just like estrogen, just like testosterone in the body. If you don't have a lot of vitamin D, you're going to be in trouble. And so I guess this is a good place to stand on my soapbox and say, go get tested. Go get your vitamin D tested, especially if you have dark skin. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So how much UVB exposure is necessary to synthesize sufficient vitamin D? Depends largely on 2 things: how intense the UV light was, and then what your pre-existing skin color is. So in general, so this is what they found at a university, is they found that dark-skinned individuals must be exposed to the UV light 5 times as long as light-skinned individuals to synthesize the same amount of vitamin D. They published a paper in which they theorized whether available UV around the world would enable individuals with different skin colors to synthesize an adequate amount of vitamin D. And so we'll look at that figure in just a second. So go ahead and listen. So this is important, listen to the following video, the 2 videos on vitamin D production in the body. They're not long, 5-10 minutes. And then jump back into this video and we'll talk about what's going on with vitamin D in the body. All right, welcome back. All right, so in this figure here, and this is from their paper, this is from Dr. Jablonski's paper, is what you see is you see these wide lines out here. The wide sideways lines are where people with they basically rated people's skin colors in three shades. So they had light skin, moderate, so kind of like tannish brown skin, and then very dark skin. And so what they did was they found at these northern latitudes and these very, I guess, maybe down here in Antarctica, but up here in these northern latitudes, most people don't live up here or way down here. But up in these northern latitudes, nobody gets enough UV light to produce enough vitamin D. And so that's what those wide lines are. And then here, where these more narrow lines are, what you find is that where is it? Is that is that now you're a little bit closer to the equator, and so people with light skin who need to produce vitamin D just like everyone else will get enough sunlight, enough UV light in these very narrow striped lines. They will get enough UV light to produce an adequate amount of vitamin D. But if you have moderate dark skin and dark skin, you won't be able to produce enough vitamin D in those areas. And then these dots here in the center, if you have light skin and moderate skin, you will get enough sunlight here in these regions to produce enough vitamin D. But if you have very dark skin, you might not get enough. And so that's basically what all of this says. And so that's, it took me a while to kind of like untangle what's going on in that particular figure, but that's exactly it. All right, so what's the correct option? Which populations are least likely to synthesize sufficient levels of vitamin D? Well, which one of these populations has an N for all of them? How did these data support the hypothesis that evolution of lighter skin colors was driven by selection for vitamin D production? Well, the further away from the equator you get, the lighter your skin color is. It also supports it because people with lighter skin at these temperate latitudes are going to have enough sunlight in those latitudes to produce enough vitamin D. All right. And then circle the correct option. So a person living further away from the equator, the risk of vitamin D deficiency would be the same or vary throughout the year. So a person living further away, so looking up here, if you live further away, would you be more likely to be insufficient in vitamin D or less likely? And so let's see, the risk of vitamin D would be the same or vary. Well, think about this. As you move further away from the equator, you get through seasons, right? The equator is always closest to the sun. But as you move further away in latitude, your UV exposure varies a lot throughout the year. And so that's going to affect your risk of vitamin D deficient throughout the year. All right. Vitamin D and folate levels in the blood are both affected by UV light. Describe the predicted effects of using a tanning booth, which exposes on the blood levels of these two vitamins. Well, I think you guys can answer that yourselves. You know, we know that UV destroys folate and we know that it boosts vitamin D. So you should be able to tell me what using a tanning booth would do to both of those levels. All right, how does recent migration affect our health? And so one of the things they talked about in the video is that some people that have ancestors from the equator have migrated recently and moved into northern latitudes, and that's not well matched. The amount of UV light they get there is not well matched to their skin color. One example is vitamin D production. And so the recommended level of circulating vitamin D is 20 nanograms per milliliter. But as you learned in part 3, vitamin D production is affected by UV intensity and skin color. Okay, so that's a lot of blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about what this means. So a sufficient amount of vitamin D is 20 nanograms. They say recommended, but that's like minimum. You want somewhere around 50, somewhere around 60 nanograms per milliliter to have a sufficient amount. And so that's bare minimum. And so what they've done here is they basically said, okay, let's look at different groups of people, like ethnicities, at certain, where is it for? So this is, these are people that they basically tested vitamin D levels among 4 different ethnicities and then separated based on male and female. So they have combined data here overall, and then they've split the ethnicities into males and females. And so what they're looking at is how much vitamin D do each of these groups just have circulating in their blood. So they didn't take these from any particular spot in the world. They took them from all over the world, and then they basically adjusted them some of the data. That's all it says. So this is a sample size of 2,600 people. That's huge. That's a big study. And so what it shows is okay, non-Hispanic white people, people with light pigmentation, generally males and females and overall have a higher levels of vitamin D in their bloodstream circulating. And you can look and say, okay, well, then you have non-Hispanic black, and then you have Mexican American, which would be kind of your moderate brown color. Non-Hispanic black would be your darker skin color, and then other, I don't know what, maybe Asian. So anyways, the trends in the data. So which subpopulation, right, gender, race, or enough is at the greatest risk? Well, which one has the lowest levels of vitamin D? Well, it's the non-Hispanic black people. Look, the bars are way lower. And which one is at the least risk for vitamin D deficiency? Non-Hispanic whites. And so what you could say is you could say that non-Hispanic white people have higher vitamin D. They're less likely to have vitamin D deficiency, but they're more likely to have their folate levels are lower, right? And if you look at non-Hispanic black people, their vitamin D levels will be lower, but their folate levels will be higher. So that's your trade-off. What is the consequence of recent human migrations on human health? Well, if you have darker skin color and you've migrated to a northern latitude, you may end up with, oh boy, hold on, I don't want you guys listening. Okay. So yeah, if you have dark skin and you migrate to a northern latitude, you'll end up with vitamin D deficiency. If you're in a northern latitude, if historically, and you move to an equatorial region, you're going to have low folate levels. And so that would affect your health. And then finally, this I'm just going to turn over to you. There's a TED Talk, How to Resolve Racially Stressful Situations, super appropriate for this lesson and for the current times. And then, so you guys can watch that and fill this out yourself. You don't need me to go through this with you. And then here in number 4, I do want you to write your own paragraph. What you have to do is use each of these terms in your paragraph so that I know you understand the relationship of these terms to what this whole lab was about. And then once you've done that, you can save this PDF and turn it back in. And that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later.